Hey, you're back. That rain is crazy. I was afraid you'd be trapped in gridlock. Go get comfortable. The beef stew is simmering, made it just for you.
I filed today. It's done.
$20 years, Naya. 2 kids. That's all it comes down to?
Not for the life I wanted. You were never enough.
So what am I left with?
Oh, one more thing. The house stays with me. The cars stay with me. You're the only one who didn't see this coming.
Outside, the rain keeps pouring down Live Oak Street. $23,000 left in his account is about to become everything he has left in this world. My name is Isaiah Brooks. I am 43 years old, and for 20 years I believed one simple thing. If a man works hard enough, stays steady enough, and never complains, his marriage will hold, no matter what gets thrown at it. I was wrong. The night my wife filed for divorce, she stood in the kitchen of our house on Live Oak Street in 3rd Ward, Houston, still in her work heels, and said, "You were never good enough, Isaiah. Not for the life I wanted." 20 years, 2 children. Every double shift I ever pulled as a construction engineer to keep that house standing. And that's how it ended, with 6 words and a folder of legal paperwork already signed. But here's the part nobody expected. Not Nia, not my own children, not even me. 14 months later, the restaurant I bought with the last $23,000 to my name, every dollar I had left in this world, would earn a Michelin star. And the woman who watched me walk out into the rain with nothing but a suitcase? She'd spend the rest of her life wondering what she missed, in a locked storage closet she never once thought to open. Before we get into this story, if you've ever poured everything you had into someone who still made you feel like it wasn't enough, stay with me. Because what I found behind a rusted door on Scott Street changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. It was a Tuesday in April,
right?
and
It
Houston
does.
does something
Let me
strange
see.
in April.
Here, taste.
Perfect.
The air gets heavy before the rain even starts, like the whole city is holding its breath. I remember that heaviness pressing against the windows of our house that evening. The ceiling fan turning slow overhead. The smell of the pot roast I'd started at 5 o'clock, because I always started dinner at 5 o'clock. 20 years of habit does that to a man. You stop thinking about it. You just do it. Looking back now, I realize I'd noticed it for weeks. The way she angled her phone screen away from me at the dinner table. The calls she stepped outside to take. The way her laugh over the phone sounded warmer than it had sounded at our own table in months. At the time, I told myself it was just work. A man believes what keeps his house standing. I'd worked a 10-hour shift out at a site off the Gulf Freeway that day, come home, showered, and gone straight to the stove, because that's what I did. Nia worked in commercial real estate downtown. Long hours, longer dinners with clients, and somewhere along the way, it had become my job to make sure the house still felt like a home when she walked back into it. I never minded. I want to be honest about that. I never once resented setting a plate at her seat at the table, even on the nights she didn't show up to eat it. Our daughter Aaliyah was 24 then, living in her own apartment near Montrose, but still calling most evenings. Our son Jamal was 26, working in insurance, quiet the way he'd always been quiet, the kind of quiet that made you wonder what he wasn't saying. I'd raised them both getting up at 4:30 in the morning to make breakfast before school, sitting through every band concert and science fair while Nia chased the next promotion, the next title, The next reason it wasn't the right time for me to take that supervisor position out in Sugarland that would have meant relocating. I turned it down without complaint. Twice. That Tuesday, Nia came home early. That alone should have told me something. She never came home early. She set her bag down on the counter, and she didn't take her shoes off. And she said my name like she was reading it off a list. Isaiah. Her voice had a strange flatness to it, like she'd rehearsed the sound of it in the car. I remember thinking, even in that first half-second, that a woman announcing an ending shouldn't sound so prepared. Some part of me, the part that had learned patience from my father, filed that thought away without knowing why. I turned from the stove. And I saw the folder in her hand before I saw her face. "I filed today," she said. "It's done." I want to tell you I said something wise in that moment, something dignified. I didn't say anything at all. I just stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand while she told me in a voice as flat as a closing statement that she'd already spoken to a lawyer, that the house was staying with her, that the Range Rover and the Camry were staying with her, that this had been coming for a long time and I was the only one who hadn't seen it. "You were never good enough, Isaiah," she said again, softer that time, almost like she felt sorry for me. "Not for what I wanted my life to look like." 20 years folded down into that one sentence. Somewhere beneath the shock, a smaller, older memory rose up on its own. The two of us on a Galveston pier at 23, Nia laughing into the wind, promising me she'd never need more than I could give her. I don't know why that memory chose that moment to surface. Maybe some part of me was already grieving the version of her I'd married, long before I understood I'd lost the version standing in front of me now. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I went upstairs and I packed one suitcase. And the only two things I took off my nightstand were a leather-bound recipe book that had belonged to my grandmother, Estelle Washington, and an old photograph of her standing outside a shotgun house in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans in 1987, flowers still dusted on her apron, laughing at something the camera never caught. I stood in the driveway for a moment before I got in my truck. The rain had started by then, coming down steady on the concrete, running in dark lines toward the storm drain. And I looked back once, through the kitchen window, and saw my wife standing there watching me. Not with regret, with relief. I drove without any destination in mind. Somewhere beneath the shock, a stray memory surfaced. My grandmother, years back, mentioning almost in passing that she used to ship sauce up to a little place on the east side of Houston, run by good people. I hadn't thought about that sentence in over a decade. I'm still not sure if my hands turned the wheel that night, or if some older, quieter part of me already knew exactly where it was going. Somehow I ended up in Fifth Ward, on Scott Street, sitting in my truck outside a boarded-up soul food restaurant that had been closed for years. Rain hammering the windshield, $23,000 sitting in my checking account, and absolutely nothing else left to lose. I don't know what made me get out of the truck. I don't know what made me walk up to that door in the rain and try the handle. But I did. And 3 weeks later, the building was mine. The first thing I did as the new owner was walk into that dark kitchen and pull open a storage closet nobody had touched in years. Inside were 31 sealed glass bottles, hand-labeled in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. My grandmother's handwriting. Standing there in the dark, I remembered being 9 years old in her Treme kitchen, asking her why she never let anybody else write down the measurements, why it all lived only in her hands and her head. She just smiled and told me some things aren't meant to travel, until the right person is standing there to carry them. I hadn't understood her then. I stood in that closet 34 years later and finally did. Tucked behind the bottles was a folded, yellowed piece of paper that read, "There's one thing I never told the family about who really owns the rights to this recipe." I turned that folded page over in my hands 3 times that first night, half convinced the words would read different if I just looked again. They never did. I had no idea yet what those words meant, but I would learn soon enough that those 31 bottles were about to turn everything upside down. The first weeks in that restaurant nearly broke me. I want to be honest about that, because I think people watching this who've started over from nothing deserve honesty, not a highlight reel. I slept on a folding cot in the back office because I didn't have money left for a hotel, and pride wouldn't let me call anybody I knew. I scrubbed decades of grease off equipment that hadn't run in years. I stood in that kitchen at 2 in the morning with my hands raw from steel wool, and more than once I asked myself what exactly I thought I was doing, buying a dead restaurant in 5th Ward with the last of my savings, like some kind of fool who'd finally lost his mind along with his marriage. But every time I opened one of those 31 bottles and let the smell hit me, cayenne, brown sugar, something smoky underneath I couldn't name yet, I was back in my grandmother's kitchen in Tremé, 7 years old, standing on a stool so I could see over the counter. There was a Sunday morning, before the sign even had letters painted on it, when I sat on the back steps of that kitchen with a cup of black coffee, watching the sun climb up over the rooftops of 5th Ward. And I thought about my own father, a quiet man who spent 30 years rebuilding transmissions in a garage off Reed Road and never once complained about a part he couldn't fix that day. He used to tell me patience wasn't the absence of frustration. It was frustration, held steady, until the right tool showed up. I didn't understand him until I was sitting on those steps myself. 31 bottles waiting behind me in a dark closet, more patient than I'd ever had reason to be. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A city bus sighed to a stop 2 streets over. 5th Ward was waking up around me, indifferent to my ruin. And somehow that indifference was the first thing in weeks that felt like comfort. Proof that the world kept turning whether I fell apart in it or not. I thought about the 2 kids I'd fed breakfast every morning for 18 years, wondering if either of them had learned patience from me, or only urgency from their mother. I didn't have an answer yet. I just drank my coffee and let 5th Ward answer for me, one bus stop at a time. A different memory came to me too, one I hadn't let myself sit with in years. Naya, early in our marriage, laughing at that same recipe book where it sat on a shelf, asking why I kept a dead woman's grocery list around the house. I'd brushed it off back then as a joke. Sitting on those back steps years later, 31 bottles waiting behind me, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. An elderly woman named Lorraine Hayes found me there on my 2nd week, standing outside on the sidewalk at dusk, staring up at the faded sign. She was 82, small and a little stooped, with reading glasses pushed up into a cap of white hair. And she told me she used to walk past this restaurant every month for years, back when it belonged to a man who bought sauce deliveries from a woman down in New Orleans. Estelle Washington, she said, before I'd told her my last name. Her voice caught a little on it, and she reached out and touched the doorframe, like she was steadying herself against a memory rather than her own knees. Sweetest woman. Never told anybody the full story behind that recipe, though. Always said it wasn't hers alone to tell. I stood there in the dark with chills running down my arms. I found a lawyer the next week, mostly to sort out the deed, but I brought the old paperwork from the closet with me almost as an afterthought. He looked at a handwritten 1986 agreement tucked among my grandmother's papers. An agreement establishing the recipe and the name rights as her separate property, held in trust, outside of any marriage or estate that might come after her. And he looked up at me over his glasses. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "this predates you by 6 years. Whatever happens with your divorce, whatever your ex-wife's attorney tries to claim, this was never marital property. This was never even yours to lose. It was hers to give." I didn't understand yet how much that single piece of paper was about to matter. Late one night, going through old ledgers I'd found stacked in a filing cabinet, I came across something that stopped me cold. A receipt from years back, a table reservation under the name Nia Brooks, my wife. Sitting in this exact restaurant, years before I ever set foot in it, with a name beside hers that wasn't mine. I sat with that receipt in my hand for a long time, my fingers pressing so hard into the paper's edge that it left a faint crease, trying to decide if it meant what I thought it meant, or if I was just a broken man looking for reasons in old paper. I didn't call Naya. I didn't call anybody. I just kept working. Aaliyah phoned me that week, and for a moment my chest loosened, thinking my daughter was checking on her father. She asked how I was holding up. She asked about the restaurant, how business was, what my plans were, whether I'd hired anyone yet. There was one question, though, that I brushed past too quickly at the time. Whether I'd already talked to a trademark attorney about the name. At the time, I only noticed a half-second pause before she asked it, the kind of pause a person takes when they're choosing which question to lead with. An odd thing for a daughter to ask her grieving father, now that I look back on it. I told her more than I probably should have. A father wanting to believe his daughter is calling out of love, not out of assignment. It wasn't until later, much later, that I understood those calls were never really about me. There was a night, about 3 weeks in, when I finally got one of the old recipes right. My grandmother's smothered oxtail, the gravy dark and rich the way I remembered it, the kitchen filling up with a smell that pulled me straight back to a narrow shotgun kitchen on a Tremé side street 30 years ago. I stood there, tasting it off a wooden spoon, alone, at 11 at night, and I cried. Not because the food was good, because for the first time since Nia handed me that folder, I felt like I still belonged to something. A woman named Ruthie Grant walked in on me like that one evening. 58 years old, solid and warm, wearing an apron she'd apparently just decided to put on without being asked. She used to work the front counter for the previous owner, she told me, and she'd been walking past every day, watching the lights come back on, wondering if anybody was finally going to bring this place back to life. "I kept some old voicemails," she said, "from Mrs. Hayes and the man who used to run this place. Business talk mostly. But there's things on there you might want to hear, Mr. Brooks." I hired her on the spot. Best decision I made in that whole first month. Around that same time, a man named Rowan Dupree reached out, a business partner type, 52, the kind of man who filled a doorway just by standing in it. He'd heard through people in the Houston restaurant scene that somebody was quietly reviving an old Fifth Ward soul food spot with an authentic Louisiana sauce nobody could place, and he wanted in. Not as an owner, he said, but as a partner who could help me scale it right. We sat down over coffee, and somewhere in that conversation, almost in passing, he mentioned he'd seen my ex-wife at a business mixer downtown a few months back. With someone. Not casually, he said. Comfortably. Like it wasn't new. I didn't say much. I just nodded and let the coffee go cold in my hand. The tension was building by then, low and constant, like weather moving in from the Gulf that you can feel in your knees before you ever see the clouds. But I kept my head down. I kept cooking, I kept scrubbing floors at midnight and testing sauce recipes at dawn, because that back storage closet had 31 bottles in it, and something in my gut told me every one of them was a piece of a story my grandmother never got to finish telling. I had no idea yet how much my family, my whole family, was about to be tested by what was hiding in that little kitchen on Scott Street. Because 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived, and it had Nia's lawyer's name on the return address. My own daughter was quietly feeding information to the woman trying to take everything I'd built. Was that betrayal? Or just a daughter who never learned any other way to keep her mother's love? Tell me which one you'd forgive first. The letter said Nia was suing me.
Of course.
Not for
I am.
alimony.
Trust me.
Not for a
We
bigger
move
cut of a house I'd already signed away without a fight. She was suing to claim the brand. Mama Stell's Treme Fire. The name I'd only just put on a hand-painted sign above the door. As marital property. Her argument, laid out in cold legal language, was that any business I built during our marriage, even one founded on my grandmother's recipes, belonged partly to her. I remember standing on the sidewalk on Scott Street reading that letter twice, then a third time, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. The trial landed at the Harris County Courthouse downtown on a gray Thursday morning in June. I wore the only suit I still owned. Nia walked in wearing something new, something with her lawyer's confidence stitched into every seam, gold at her wrists, a smile aimed at cameras I hadn't even noticed were there until I sat down. The courtroom smelled like cold air conditioning and old varnish, the kind of smell that makes a room feel like it's already decided something before anyone's said a word. My tie felt too tight. I kept my hands flat on my knees so nobody would see them shake. Somewhere behind me, a reporter's pen scratched against a notepad, small and steady, the only sound keeping time in a room that otherwise felt like it was holding its breath. Because somebody had tipped off local media. A black man in 5th Ward, $23 from broke, building a restaurant that was already turning heads in the neighborhood. That was a story people wanted to watch play out, one way or the other. My wife's attorney stood first. He put up a screen, and on it were text messages. Dozens of them, between Nia and Aaliyah. My daughter reporting back. Dates the walk-in cooler was delivered. How many tables we'd sold out on a Friday night. Even a message suggesting how her mother might handle the situation with the old recipes before I got the trademark filed. I sat very still. I want you to understand what that felt like. Watching my own daughter's handwriting projected onto a courtroom screen like evidence in a robbery. Then it got worse. Aaliyah's attorney called her up, and she walked to the stand in front of a small cluster of local reporters who'd been let into the gallery. And she said, in a voice that cracked exactly the way a voice cracks when somebody has rehearsed sounding sincere, that her father was using our family's legacy, her great-grandmother's legacy, as a weapon to punish her mother. He's not doing this to heal, she told the courtroom. He's doing this to get back at her. When her voice cracked on that word, something old and helpless rose up in my chest. A memory of Aaliyah at 6 years old, refusing to sleep unless I checked under her bed 3 times, trusting me completely to keep her safe from things she couldn't see. I thought, too, of the recipe book on our old shelf, of Aaliyah as a girl tracing her finger along my grandmother's handwriting, asking if she could learn to cook the real way someday. I wondered when that girl had gone missing. I noticed her hand shaking slightly against the witness stand's railing, too. A tremor pressed down hard enough that only a father who'd watched that same small hand learn to hold a pencil would ever catch it. Her eyes found mine once, just once, and dropped away just as fast. Like she couldn't hold the weight of looking at me while she said it. I understood something sitting there that I couldn't have understood at the time she was born. Aaliyah spent her whole childhood watching her mother's love work like a transaction. Attention paid out for being useful, praise rationed for being impressive, warmth that had to be earned fresh every week. I gave my children steady love without asking for anything back. Nia taught our daughter that love was a performance review. So when the divorce split the family into two camps, Aaliyah didn't choose the parent who was right. She chose the parent whose love felt conditional enough to still be worth chasing. That trembling hand on the railing wasn't a woman committing betrayal without a second thought. It was a scared 24-year-old, still trying to be enough for a mother who'd never once told her she already was. I sat with my hands flat on the table in front of me, and I did not move. 24 years old, and my own child stood in a public courtroom and called my grandmother's recipe book a revenge plot. I won't pretend that didn't hollow something out of me. It did. It still does, some nights, if I let myself think about it too long. But I had learned something in that little kitchen on Scott Street over the past 3 months. I had learned patience is its own kind of strength. And silence, held the right way, can say more than shouting ever could. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I stood and I asked the judge's permission to enter one document into evidence. The 1986 agreement my lawyer had found, establishing my grandmother's recipe and name rights as her separate legal property, held in trust decades before Nia and I ever met. Decades before any marriage could have laid a single claim to it. The judge read it again, looked up at Nia's attorney over the top of her glasses. I watched Nia's shoulders drop half an inch, so slight I doubt anyone else in that gallery caught it. 20 years married to a woman teaches you to read the parts of her that never made it into words. Somewhere behind me, a chair creaked. Nobody in that gallery so much as breathed loud. "This predates the marriage by 6 years," she said. "This restaurant, this recipe, this name, none of it was ever community property to begin with. This claim is dismissed." It was over in less than 4 minutes. I heard a commotion behind me before I even turned around. Aaliyah was crying in the hallway outside, cameras still rolling, and her husband, a man I'd only met a handful of times, was standing a few feet away, reading something off his phone with a face gone hard and flat. Later I'd learn what he was reading. The same exhibit list that had just been entered into the public court record that morning. Financial records and message threads that, once filed, any attorney could pull. His own lawyer, whom I'd later learn he'd quietly retained weeks earlier over unrelated money concerns, forwarded them to him within the hour. What he read confirmed things about his wife's spending and his mother-in-law's coaching that he apparently hadn't known before that morning. He filed for divorce from Aaliyah 9 days later. I take no pleasure in telling you that. I only tell you because it's true, and because it showed me, all over again, how far people will go once they convince themselves the ends justify it. I found
The court
Nia in
has
the
reviewed
hallway
the
outside the
evidence.
courtroom,
Your Honor, we request
alone for a
leniency.
moment,
Please
the
consider our
reporters
position.
The ruling
occupied
stand-
elsewhere. She still had that composed look on her face, the one she'd worn the night she handed me that folder in our kitchen. But something in her eyes had shifted. Something uncertain, flickering under the surface for the first time since I'd known her. I looked at her, and I kept my voice level, the way I'd kept it level for 20 years of not complaining. "You took the house I paid for with overtime sweat," I said. "You erased my name off everything we built together. But you never got my roots, Nia. You never even knew where to look for them." She didn't answer. For the first time in longer than I could remember, Nia Brooks had nothing to say. I walked out of that courthouse into the Houston afternoon heat, and I got in my truck and I drove straight back to Scott Street, back to the kitchen, back to 31 bottles that had just survived their first legal battle. I thought that was the hardest day this restaurant would ever put me through. I was wrong. Because what Rowan Dupree was about to tell me, about a shell company, about secret calls, about a plan that started 3 years before Nia ever filed those papers, was about to make that courtroom look like the easy part. Rowan came to see me 2 weeks after the trial, and he didn't sit down before he spoke. "Isaiah," he said, "there's something you need to hear, and I need you to hear it from me before you hear it from anybody else." He told me my wife had reached out to him, more than once. Months before the divorce was ever filed, she'd wanted to know if he'd be willing to help her acquire the rights to the recipe and the name, quietly, through a business entity that wouldn't trace back to her, so that she could control it, license it, and eventually, in his words, retire it from the family altogether. I asked him why he was only telling me now. Because at the time, he said, it was just a woman asking a hypothetical question at a networking event. I didn't think anything of it until I watched her stand up in that courtroom and argue this was rightfully hers, while every instinct in me knew she'd been circling this restaurant long before you ever set foot in Fifth Ward, building a whole legal argument on the idea that she'd only just discovered what it was worth. I sat with that for a long while after Rowan left, and something clicked into place that I'd been circling without naming for months. Nia's own mother had gone through a divorce with nothing in her name. No assets, no leverage, nothing she'd built that couldn't be taken from her in an afternoon. Nia had watched that happen at 13 years old and made herself a promise. She would never again stand in a room owning nothing. That promise had curdled over 20 years into something else. A need not just to have things, but to control everything near her, including things that were never hers to control. My grandmother's recipe threatened her in a way she probably couldn't have explained out loud. It was proof that something real, something rooted, could be worth everything without her fingerprints anywhere on it. She couldn't tolerate that. So she did what she'd always done with things she couldn't own outright. She tried to make sure nobody else valued it enough to keep it either. That same week, a federal inquiry, the kind that follows wire transfers and shell companies across state lines until it lands on somebody's desk, that had quietly opened into a pattern of asset transfers connected to Nia's real estate dealings, widened its scope. My son Jamal called me, his voice thin and shaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "Dad," he said, "she told me it was routine paperwork, consolidating some family accounts after the divorce. I trusted her enough not to read every page the way I should have. Now my name's on property transfer documents I don't fully understand, tied to money I never saw." I sat with that phone against my ear for a long moment, feeling something old and tired settle over me. My son, 26 years old, caught in something his mother had built around him without ever asking if he wanted to be part of it. I remembered him at 8, standing next to me in the driveway, holding a wrench too big for his hand, dead serious about helping me fix the lawnmower. He'd always trusted the people he loved a little too completely. I used to think that was a flaw I needed to toughen out of him. Sitting there listening to his voice crack over the phone, I understood it had never been a flaw. It was just a boy who'd learned to trust his father, and never learned in time that not everyone in this family had earned the same trust. I told him to get his own attorney. I told him I loved him. I didn't tell him I'd fix it, because I'd learned by then that fixing other grown people's choices isn't a father's job, no matter how much it aches to sit still and watch. The Houston media, once it caught the scent of a federal inquiry attached to a woman who just lost a very public courtroom battle over a Fifth Ward restaurant, didn't let go. Nia's name started appearing in local business coverage for all the wrong reasons. Two of her biggest commercial clients quietly walked. The man Rowan had seen her with, the one from the mixer, the one who'd apparently been in the picture longer than anyone admitted, left her within 2 weeks of the story breaking. No public statement, just gone. Around the same time, going through old ownership documents with Rowan at the kitchen table late one night, we found something that made the whole shape of it click into place. 3 years earlier, 3 years before Nia ever filed for divorce, a shell company had made an offer on the very building I now owned on Scott Street. The offer had gone nowhere at the time because the previous owner wasn't selling. But the paper trail led back, quietly, carefully, to Nia. I remembered then the receipt I'd found weeks earlier, the reservation under her name, years before I ever walked through that door, and realized it hadn't been a coincidence I'd misread. It had been the first thread of a rope she'd been tying long before I noticed the knot. She had wanted this place before I ever knew it existed. Not to build something, to bury something. Both of my children called me that same week, within days of each other, each in their own kind of panic. Aaliyah, tearful, asking if I could help her mother's legal situation, help smooth things over, help make the story go away. Jamal asking again if I'd step in and use my new lawyer to untangle the transfer documents he'd signed. I agreed to a call with both of them together, the three of us on the phone at once, something we hadn't done since before the divorce. I listened. I let them both talk themselves out. And then I said the only thing I had left to say. You both chose a side a long time ago, I told them, my voice calm, steady, the same voice I'd used my whole life to hold a house together. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done pretending I didn't notice. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Some doors close quietest of all. After I hung up, I didn't go back to the kitchen right away. I walked 2 blocks over to where Buffalo Bayou cuts along the edge of the ward, and I stood there a long while, listening to the water move in the dark, the streetlights laying long orange stripes across the surface, turning over something Rowan had mentioned weeks earlier, almost in passing, that Nia had once told him, half joking, that sometimes people needed to be shocked awake before they could really live. At the time, I'd taken it as nothing. Standing at that water's edge, it didn't feel like nothing anymore. I thought about my father again, about patience held steady until the right tool arrives. I thought about the certified letter, the shell company, the years of quiet architecture I'd never seen being built around me, and understood something my grandmother must have known all along. That some people build with their hands, and some people build with other people's blind trust. I'd spent my whole marriage assuming those were the same kind of building. I wasn't angry standing there. I was just quiet in a way I hadn't been in years. Months rolled forward after that the way they do when you stop counting them one at a time. Order after order, service after service, until 14 months after I first bought that building with my last $23,000, a Michelin inspector walked through our door without a word of warning and sat at a two-top by the window. I found out 3 weeks later, the same way most restaurant owners find out. A phone call, a number I didn't recognize, a voice telling me Mama Stell's Treme Fire had just earned a Michelin star. I stood in that kitchen, and I put my hand flat on the stainless steel counter, and I thought about a woman named Estelle Washington, standing in a narrow kitchen in Tremé 30 years earlier. And I thought about 31 sealed bottles in a storage closet nobody had opened in years. The lines on Scott Street kept growing. Nia's name kept fading from the pages that used to feature her. 2 lives, moving in exactly opposite directions, from the exact same starting point. But the biggest piece of this story, the one that would finally explain everything, the one hiding in an old voicemail Ruthie Grant had kept on her phone for years without knowing what it meant, was still waiting to come out. I hung my grandmother's photograph up myself, on a Sunday morning before we opened, right beside the kitchen door where every server and every line cook would pass it 100 times a shift. Estelle Washington, 1987, flower on her apron, laughing at something the camera never caught. I stood back and looked at it for a long while before I ever unlocked the front door that day. Ruthie Grant had become more than staff to me by then. I made her general manager of the front of house, with a small equity stake in the restaurant, because a woman who'd walked past a boarded-up building for years just hoping somebody would bring it back to life had earned the right to own a piece of what it became. Mrs. Lorraine Hayes, 82 years old, still sharp as anything, agreed to come by once a week as what Ruthie started calling our honorary grandmother. Greeting guests, telling stories, tasting whatever new batch of sauce I was testing that week. I set her up with a small monthly percentage of the profits, because without her memory of a woman sending sauce up from New Orleans once a month, I might never have known where to start looking for the truth. Jamal came by the restaurant on a slow Tuesday afternoon not long after, still thinner than I liked to see him, and he didn't say much at first. Just sat at the counter and watched Ruthie work the line for a while, turning a coffee mug slowly in his hands like he was deciding whether he was allowed to be there. Eventually, he asked if he could help wash dishes for an hour, the way he used to help me change oil in the driveway, back when he was 12 and full of questions. I let him. We didn't talk about the transfer documents, or the lawyers, or his mother. We just worked, side by side, the water running warm over our hands, steam fogging the little window over the sink. And somewhere under the running water and the clatter of pans, I caught myself thinking that this was the closest thing to prayer I'd done in months. 2 men working in silence, forgiving each other without ever having to say the word. Before he left, he stopped at the door and said, quiet, almost like he didn't want it to count as a big moment. "I should have read the papers, Dad." I told him most of us learn that lesson exactly once. I was glad his didn't cost him more than it did. It was while finishing that ownership review with Rowan that one last date caught my eye. The retainer agreement for Nia's divorce attorney, signed the same year the shell company made its offer on this building. Not a whim on some ordinary Tuesday. Architecture, built slowly, with me standing inside it the entire time, never once suspecting I was living inside somebody else's blueprint. Then Ruthie remembered the voicemails.
Son. You did it. We're so
She'd
proud.
kept an old
Thank
phone
you,
in a
everyone.
drawer at home, one she hadn't used in years, and on it were messages from the previous owner going back over a decade. Routine business calls mostly, deliveries and invoices. But buried among them was one she'd nearly deleted a dozen times and somehow never had. A call where a woman's voice, unmistakably Nia's, was recorded discussing the recipe with the previous owner, years before I ever bought the place. On it, Nia laughed, that easy, confident laugh I used to love, and said that spreading a little doubt about whether the old sauce recipe was even legitimate, even worth anything, would be the fastest way to make sure nobody in the family ever valued it enough to fight for it. I sat in the back office with that recording playing on a phone that had survived years in a kitchen drawer, and I understood, finally and completely, Exactly what my grandmother's note had meant when she wrote that there was one thing she'd never told the family. She hadn't been protecting a secret. She'd been protecting something she must have somehow sensed would need protecting one day. Word got around the neighborhood the way word does in Fifth Ward, quietly and completely. Our restaurant stopped being just a place people came to eat. It became a place people came to sit, to talk, to bring their own family stories in the door with them. An older man told me one Saturday, over a plate of oxtail, that the smell reminded him of his mother's kitchen on Lyons Avenue back in the 70s. A young woman cried a little, telling Ruthie the cornbread tasted exactly like her late grandmother's, down to the honey. The night we hung Estelle's photograph officially, during service, with the dining room full, I stepped out from the kitchen for a moment, and somebody, I never did find out who, started clapping. Then the whole room joined in. I stood there in my apron, in a building I'd bought with the last $23,000 I had in this world, and the whole room was applauding a photograph of a woman most of them had never met. I thought, standing there, about the folder Naya had carried into our kitchen that Tuesday evening. About how certain she'd looked handing it to me, like she was closing a door on something small and used up. She had no idea what was behind the other door, the one on Scott Street. The one she'd spent 3 years trying to make sure never opened at all. Late one night, long after closing, I stood alone in the kitchen, tasting a new batch of sauce off a wooden spoon. Cayenne, honey, and the one ingredient I still can't say out loud on camera, because some things really do belong only to family. It carried me straight back, the way it always does, to a narrow kitchen in Tremé, my grandmother's hands moving faster than mine ever could, flour dust catching the light from a window over the sink. That same week, the old voicemail Ruthie had found made its way onto Houston social media. I didn't leak it. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to me that you know I never went looking for that kind of ending. Somebody who'd heard about it through the federal case shared it, and once it was out, there was no calling it back. Naya's name disappeared from the local business pages within a month. She left Houston not long after. I don't know where she went, and for the first time in a long time, I found I genuinely didn't need to know. On that recording, Naya laughed and said that undermining an old woman's legacy would be the fastest way to wake me up and set herself free. Instead, that exact act of doubt is the reason those 31 bottles sat untouched in a storage closet for years, waiting for someone in the family to finally open that door again. The very thing she did to erase my grandmother's legacy is the reason that legacy now wears a Michelin star on a hand-painted sign above a door on Scott Street. You cannot design an ending like that. Life just hands it to you sometimes. A few weeks ago, I video called my grandson, Aaliyah's boy, not yet 2, gripping the phone with both hands. Aaliyah and I are speaking again, slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild something down to the studs. Watching her own marriage end, and her mother's name quietly disappear from the pages that used to feature it, seemed to open something in her the courtroom never could. She called me first. That mattered more than I expected. Jamal comes by most Sundays now, no wrench in hand this time, just a plate and a seat at the counter. And some nights, I catch myself watching him laugh at something Ruthie said and thinking, quietly, there he is. There we are. Some nights, I still set an extra plate out of habit before I catch myself. I've stopped apologizing to the empty chair. I just let it sit there, a small monument to the years I don't regret giving. A reporter asked me recently what I'd say to Nia if she ever walked back through that door. She took everything written down on paper, I told her, but she never got the fire that runs through my blood. that was never hers to take. This story reminds us that legacy doesn't survive on grief. It survives on small, repeated rituals, kept just specific enough that no one can talk you out of them. If you're a widow who hasn't touched his recipe box since the funeral, pull out one card this Sunday, cook it exactly as written, and call one grandchild to come taste it with you. Not to remember him in the abstract, but to keep his hands alive in yours. If a son or daughter mocks something small you still hold on to, a hymn, a quilt pattern, a Sunday phone call at 4, don't argue, just keep doing it. The things they call outdated are usually the very things still strong enough to outlast them. These scripts are born from genuine human creativity and a desire to confront social truths. AI acted as a co-pilot, helping organize thoughts so that powerful messages of fairness, forgiveness, and human potential could touch hearts worldwide. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.